She was 22 years old, and she had exactly $8 to her name, a winter coat with a broken zipper, and a leather sewing kit the size of a paperback novel that had belonged to a woman she called Aunt May. Though May Hollister had never been her aunt by blood, only by the grace of a world that occasionally gets something right. When May died in February, she left Clara Ashfield nothing in her will, because May had nothing to leave. The house May rented on Birch Hollow Road went back to the landlord before the ground thawed. The landlord, a man named Gerald Pickett, gave Clara 48 hours to clear out her things and his late tenants both. He was not unkind about it. He just wasn't the kind of man who let sentiment cost him money. So Clara packed what she could carry, gave the rest to the church thrift store on Calder Street, and walked out of Birch Hollow with that sewing kit in her bag and $8 folded into the front pocket of her jeans. If you have ever stood at the edge of a place you called home and felt the particular silence that falls when you understand, truly understand, that no one is waiting for you anywhere, then you already know something of what Clara felt that morning. And if you haven't, we hope you never do. She had grown up in the county foster system, moved through 7 homes by the time she was 15, and none of them had been cruel, exactly. They had simply been temporary, in the way that rentals are temporary. A space to occupy, a bed to sleep in, a table to eat at, but not a place that would remember you were there. When Clara was 15, she was placed with a widow named May Hollister, who lived alone and kept a small but serious sewing room off the back of her kitchen. May was 67 years old and had the posture of a woman who had spent 40 years bending over a work table. She had grown up in Alabama, the daughter of a seamstress, and she had learned the trade the way people used to learn things. By watching, then doing, then being corrected without softness until she got it right. She did not treat Clara as a rival with ceremony. On the second day, she handed her a seam ripper and pointed to a pile of torn curtains that needed dismantling. Clara didn't know what a seam ripper was. May showed her once, and then watched from the other side of the table with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world and no intention of wasting it. That was how it began. Over the next 7 years, May taught Clara everything she knew. Not just how to sew a straight seam, but how to read fabric the way you read a person's face, the way a linen relaxes under heat, the way wool remembers its shape, the way old silk frays if you look at it too hard. She taught her how to take a coat apart, at every seam, and put it back together so the original owner couldn't recognize the surgery. She taught her how to replace a zipper in a vintage dress without leaving a scar, how to reline a blazer, how to replicate a fissing button by carving one from a scrap of bone or antler she'd keep in a tin on the windowsill. She taught her how to cut a pattern from nothing, from memory and measurement and instinct, until Clara's hands knew the math before her mind did. May never said she was proud of her. But one afternoon in Clara's 19th year, she came into the sewing room without knocking and stood behind her for a long moment, watching her work a complicated French seam on a piece of Dupioni silk. Then she said, in that flat Alabama voice, "Your tension is good," and she walked back out. Clara understood perfectly. It was the highest thing May knew how to say. The only thing May gave her formally, deliberately, was the sewing kit. It was old. A long, slim leather case, hand-stitched in a dark burgundy that had faded to the color of dried roses. Inside were May's best tools, kept in individual loops of worn elastic. Her Italian shears with the weighted handles, a bone folder, a set of marking awls in graduated sizes, a brass thimble worn smooth on one side, and a small curved needle that May called the widow's needle because it was used for closing seams that couldn't be reached any other way. "You keep those sharp," May had said, the morning she handed the case to Clara. "A dull tool is a lazy tool, and a lazy tool will ruin your work." She hadn't said goodbye. She hadn't needed to. That had been 3 months before May's heart gave out in her sleep. Clara was not invited to the funeral. She didn't know there were people to invite her, people who might have wanted her there. May's actual family, a sister in Georgia and a nephew she hadn't spoken to in years, arrived 2 days later and did what families do. They took what they wanted and arranged the rest. The nephew, a man named Donnie Pickett, a different Pickett, no relation to the landlord, just a coincidence the county seemed to enjoy, had looked at Clara standing in the doorway of the sewing room and said, politely enough, "That's all equipment, sweetheart. That's assets." He'd meant the sewing machines, the dress forms, the bolts of fabric stacked in the corner. He hadn't meant the leather case, which was already in Clara's bag. She had not corrected his inventory. So there she was in March, standing on a county road outside a town called Greylock, Tennessee, with a broken coat and $8, and the most important thing May Hollister had ever owned. She had heard of Greylock from a woman at the bus station in Knoxville who had been passing through and mentioned, almost as an aside, that there were rental rooms above the dry goods store. Clara had gotten off the bus at the wrong stop and walked the last 6 miles because she couldn't afford another ticket. The town, when she finally saw it, was smaller than she'd expected and quieter than she'd hoped. It sat in a narrow valley between two ridgelines, and the main street was exactly 1 block long. There was the dry goods store, a diner, a hardware supply, a post office about the size of a garden shed, and a church with a hand-lettered sign that reads Skevis's Sunday and Whenever You Need US. The woman who ran the dry goods store was named Patsy Creel. She was short and solid, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and the air of someone accustomed to making decisions quickly and living with them. She told Clara the room above the store had been rented. She told her this without apology, and then, while Clara was still absorbing it, she looked at her, really looked at her, the way women of a certain age sometimes do, seeing more than what's on the surface, and said, "There is something, if you're not afraid of work." Clara said she was not afraid of work. Patsy led her out the back door of the store and up the hill behind Main Street to a property Clara would not have noticed from the road. It sat behind a stand of old hemlock trees, a small building, more of a large cabin, really, that had once been a tailor's workshop. The man who had built it, a German immigrant named Werner Schreiber, had set up shop in Greylock sometime in the 1890s, had made good suits for 30 years, and had died without heirs. The building had passed through 3 sets of hands since then, and had been vacant for 12 years. The county took it for taxes, Patsy said, standing in front of it with her arms crossed. They'll sell the deed for whatever clears the lien. Last I heard, it's $15. She paused. I know that sounds. I have 8, Clara said. Patsy looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Do you know anything useful?" Clara opened her bag and took out the leather sewing case. Patsy nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "All right," she said. "I'll cover the other 7. You can pay me back in trade. I've got a pile of mending that would break your heart." The building was in worse shape than it looked from the outside, which was already bad. The front window was boarded over with plywood that had warped and cracked, letting in cold air in thin, steady streams. The floorboards in the back room had buckled from water damage. A section of the roof had been leaking for years, and the damage ran deep. Every surface was covered in the kind of grime that takes decades to accumulate. Soot, sawdust, old grease, the residue of things that had been stored and forgotten. Mice had been through, more than once, but the bones of the place were extraordinary. Werner Schreiber had built his workshop to last. The framing was hand-hewn chestnut, a wood that had mostly disappeared from the American countryside by the time Clara was born, killed off by the blight decades before. And what remained was precious. The walls were plumb. The foundation was mortared fieldstone, tight and solid, without a single crack she could find. Along the back wall ran a long built-in workbench, heavy oak, fitted with shallow drawers below and a row of pegs above, where tools had once hung. The drawers were mostly empty, but the hardware, the hinges, the drawer pulls, the pegs themselves, were hand-forged iron, dark with age but solid. Someone had built this room the way people used to build things, assuming it would outlast them, and caring about what came after. Clara stood in the middle of the ruined floor and felt something settle in her chest that she didn't have a word for. She had grown up in other people's spaces, in rooms that were temporary by definition, in houses that were careful to remind her she was a guest. This place was a wreck. It smelled like rot and mice and old smoke. It was hers. She paid Patsy Creel back in 7 weeks, working mornings and evenings on a pile of alterations and repairs that had been accumulating in a basket behind the store counter for what appeared to be several years. She repaired a man's heavy canvas work coat, whose elbows had worn through, replacing the worn panels with pieces of matching canvas she had to dye herself to get the color right. She replaced the zipper on a girl's winter jacket, let out the hem on a dress for a woman who mentioned, quietly and without elaboration, that her husband liked it longer now. She took in a suit belonging to the Methodist minister, who had lost weight during a long illness and whose collar had been hanging loose for months. Each finished piece she wrapped in tissue and left on the counter, with a note saying what had been done and how. Word traveled in Greylock the way it travels in small towns, not through announcement but through observation. People noticed that Patsy's alterations pile was shrinking. People noticed the canvas coat on Russ Ingram's back looked new at the elbows. The Methodist minister's suit fit him like he'd bought it last week. Meanwhile, Clara worked on the workshop. She had no carpentry training, not the formal kind. But May had been a practical woman who believed in knowing how to manage your own space, and over the years had shown Clara small things: how to set a nail without splitting wood, how to mix a cleaning solution that would cut through old grease without lifting paint, how to assess whether a floorboard was structurally failed or just cosmetically ruined. Clara could assess. She was good at it. It was the same skill May had tried to teach her about fabric: look past the surface damage to the integrity underneath. The roof was the first emergency. She couldn't fix the buckled floor until the water source was stopped. She spent 3 days on it, or rather, on the ground outside of it, because the pitch was steep and she had no ladder tall enough. She improvised. She rented a ladder from the hardware supply for 50 cents a day, borrowed a second one from a man named Earl Gibbs, who ran a small engine repair shop on the edge of town, and strung a rope between them as a stabilizing line. It was not the safest arrangement in the world. It worked. She found the failed area, a section near the chimney, where the old cedar shingles had slid and let the underlayment rot, and patched it with new shingles. She bought 2 at a time when she had money. Earl Gibbs had watched her work from the road for a while before he said anything. When he did speak, it was to point out that she was setting the shingles in the wrong direction relative to the ridge. She listened, looked where he was pointing, and saw immediately that he was right. She redid the section. He didn't say anything else. But the next morning there was a small bundle of salvaged copper flashing leaning against the building's wall. Exactly what she needed to seal around the chimney, and no note, because no note was required. The floor was a longer project. The buckled boards had to come up, the subfloor beneath assessed and dried, the joists checked for integrity. 2 joists were soft. She learned by asking Earl how to sister a joist, to run a new piece of lumber alongside the damaged one and lag bolt them together. Earl showed her once, using a scrap he had lying around. She did the 2 joists herself, working on her knees in the cold, and when she stood up and jumped on the repaired section to test it, it didn't move at all. She let herself feel that, just for a moment, before she went back to work. She was laying new floorboards, rough sawn pine she'd found stacked and drying in the back of the hardware supply, waiting for a buyer, when she noticed the workbench. She had been using it as a staging surface, setting tools and materials on it while she worked. One afternoon, she pushed a box of nails aside and heard a hollow sound from beneath the far end of the bench. Not the hollow sound of empty space. The bench top was solid, but something beneath the bench itself, within the built structure. She got down on her knees and looked. There was a false panel in the back of the bottom section, fitted so cleanly into the framing that she'd taken it for a solid back wall. It was the same chestnut as the rest of the bench, same finish, same age. But the grain didn't quite match the piece beside it, and there were no nails. She ran her fingers along the edges and found 2 small iron hooks, recessed nearly flush. She unhooked them, and the panel swung outward on a hinge she hadn't known was there. Behind it was a narrow space, perhaps 4 inches deep and 2 feet wide. Inside the space were 4 objects: a folded garment, a small tin box, the kind that might once have held tobacco or tea, a pair of tailor's shears, old with ornate handles engraved with a vine pattern, and a letter folded twice and sealed with a plain wax impression. Clara sat back on her heels and felt the air in the room change. It was the same feeling she'd had standing in the middle of the ruined floor on that first day, looking at Werner Schreiber's hand-hewn chestnut walls. The feeling of something that had been waiting. She took the garment out first. It unfolded into a waistcoat, a man's vest, cut from a fine charcoal wool, hand-sewn with a precision she recognized immediately and felt in her chest like a cord. The stitches were 12 to the inch on the fell seams, consistent to the eye and the touch, the kind of work that takes not just skill but devotion. The lining was cream silk, still intact. She turned it over in her hands for a long time before she set it carefully on the workbench and picked up the letter. The handwriting on the outside was in German, which she couldn't read, but the letter inside was in English, careful, deliberate English, the kind written by someone who had learned it as a second language and respected it accordingly. It began, "To the one who finds this workshop still standing. My name is Werner Schreiber. I was a tailor in this valley for 31 years, and I built this room with my own hands because I wanted a place that would outlast me, and because I believed that the work we do with our hands deserves a proper home." Clara lowered herself to sit on the new pine floorboards she just laid and read the rest. Werner Schreiber had come to Greylock from Bavaria in 1887 with his wife, Anneliese, and their daughter, Liesel. He had built his shop and built his trade, and for 20 years the 3 of them had worked and saved and lived small, as immigrants do. keeping their heads down and their expectations modest, and their eyes on a future that was always 10 years away. He had saved $240 in gold, his daughter's education, his wife's security, his own old age compressed into a sum he counted once a month and never spent. He had hidden it here because he did not trust banks, having seen two fail in his first decade in America, and because this bench was a vault disguised as furniture, and he had built it himself, and he trusted what he had built. Then, in 1917, the letter said, things changed. The town turned against German immigrants in the way that towns in wartime turn against things that seem foreign. Not all at once, not with official sanction, but in the slow, leaching way of small exclusions and cold shoulders, and whispered conversations that stop when you enter a room. Werner's English was good, but his accent remained. His wife spoke little English and would not leave the house. His trade dried up. When he finally locked the workshop for the last time, he was not driven out by anyone he could name. He just understood that his welcome had expired. He had meant to come back for the money. He never did. I am writing this in the spring of 1918, the letter continued. Annalise and I are going to her sister in Ohio, and Liselle is already there, married now to a good man, and we will start again. I do not take the money because I do not know if the borders will be watched, and gold is conspicuous, and I am tired of being conspicuous. I leave it here with this note and this hope that whoever finds it is building something, that whoever finds it needs it more than I need to carry it. Use it for what it was always meant to be used for. A future. Someone's future. It doesn't have to be mine. The shears are good shears. They were my father's, made in Solingen. If you know what they are, keep them and use them. If you don't, they are worth something to someone who does. The waistcoat is the best work I ever made. I made it for myself, and I never wore it, because by the time I finished it, there was nowhere to wear it to. But it is honest work, and I am not ashamed of it. Let it belong to this room. Clara held the letter for a long time after she finished reading. Outside, the light was going, and the workshop was growing dim around her. The tin box sat on the bench where she'd set it. She opened it slowly. The gold coins were double eagles, $20 pieces, 12 of them. $240 in gold, as Werner had said. In melt value alone, it was worth considerably more now. She held one of them in her palm and felt the weight of it, the specific, unignorable weight of a thing that has been saved and not spent. She thought of Werner Schreiber, bending over this bench in this room, cutting fine wool and hand-stitching silk, building a future in small increments for 30 years, and then walking away from it because the town stopped seeing him. She thought of May Hollister, who had taught her everything she knew and died in the night, without ceremony. She thought of all the people who build things and are not thanked for building them, whose work outlasts their recognition, whose hands leave marks that strangers find years later, without knowing whose hands made them. She was not an intruder here. She was the answer to a letter written 100 years before she was born. The next morning, she went to see Patsy Creel. She didn't tell Patsy about the coins, not at first. She told her about Werner Schreiber, which Patsy seemed to find more surprising. Schreiber, Patsy said, turning the name over like something she was trying to place. There's a headstone with that name up in the old part of the cemetery. I always wondered. Clara showed her the letter. Patsy read it slowly, holding it at arm's length with her reading glasses down from the top of her head, where she usually kept them. She was quiet for a moment when she finished. Well, Patsy said finally. What are you going to do with it? Clara had thought about this all night. The Greylock Library, housed in 2 rooms above the post office, had a collection of county records going back to 1890. It took 3 visits and the help of a retired schoolteacher named Bess Maynard, who volunteered on Thursdays, to trace Werner Schreiber's daughter, Liesel. She had married a man named Frank Halverson in 1914. She had died in 1971 in Columbus, Ohio, at the age of 78, leaving 2 sons. One of those sons, a man named Paul Halverson, had died in 1998. The other, James Halverson, was 73 years old and lived in Dayton. Clara wrote him a letter. She sent it to an address Bess found in the county directory and held her breath for 2 weeks. The letter that came back was short, and the man who wrote it was clearly overwhelmed. He said he had grown up hearing stories of his grandmother's father, the tailor in Tennessee, and had assumed everything from that time was simply gone. He said his grandmother had kept a photograph of the workshop on her dresser until she died. He said he didn't know what to say. Clara wrote back and told him what she had found. She told him about the money, the shears, the waistcoat. She told him she wanted to do right by it. What happened next was something Clara had not expected. And perhaps Werner Schreiber, in his tired and hopeful 1918 heart, had not expected either. James Halverson drove down from Dayton on a Saturday in late May. A thin man with his grandmother's cheekbones and steady hands, and he sat in the repaired workshop that smelled of new pine and linseed oil and old chestnut. And he held the waistcoat for a long time without speaking. When he finally looked up, he said, "He built this room." "He did," Clara said. James was quiet again. Then he said, "My grandmother talked about this room. She said it was the best place she'd ever known. She said he used to let her sit on the bench and hand him pins while he worked. He ran his palm along the oak of the workbench. She would have given anything to be here." They agreed on what seemed right. The gold coins were technically abandoned property, and legally, after a certain number of years, belonged to the finder. But neither Clara nor James had any particular appetite for the letter of the law when the spirit of something was so much clearer. They divided it, half to James as Werner's heir, and half to Clara as the one Werner had addressed. James refused a larger share. "He left it for you," James said simply. "He said so." He took the shears, because they had been his great-great-grandfather's, and because he wanted something to pass to his own grandchildren. He left the waistcoat. "It belongs here," he said, which is exactly what Clara had hoped he would say. The workshop opened in September. Clara Ashfield's sign was modest, hand-routed into a piece of reclaimed chestnut, the letters clean and deep: Ashfield Alterations and Repairs. Patsy Creel had advised against the ampersand. Clara had kept it anyway. The repaired floor was covered with a wool rug she had woven herself from scraps over the winter. The old workbench held her machines and tools, the leather sewing case occupying a specific spot at the right end where she could reach it without looking. On the wall above the bench, she had hung the waistcoat in a shallow frame behind glass. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that good work lasts. That hands leave traces. That a room built with care and intention can hold that intention for a century and release it to the right person at the right time. Werner Schreiber's shears were gone to Dayton with James Halverson. And that was right. But May's shears hung on the peg beside the machine, and they were sharp, because Clara kept them sharp, because a dull tool is a lazy tool, and a lazy tool will ruin your work. She thought about May a great deal in those early months. In the quiet way you think about someone when their absence has become a permanent part of the texture of your life. She had not been able to grieve properly in the rush of loss and displacement that followed February. She grieved now, in the evenings, in this room that was hers, in a way no room had ever been hers before. She grieved and she worked, and the two things were not incompatible. May had taught her that too, without ever saying it directly. You don't stop, you assess what you have. You begin the work in front of you. The town did what small towns do when they find something worth keeping. They showed up. Russ Ingram brought his son's baseball jacket for a patch. Bess Maynard brought a quilt that had belonged to her mother and needed a section relined. The Methodist minister, whose name was Gordon Hale, and who had been watching the workshop's transformation with visible curiosity from the street, came in one afternoon with a box of old vestments that the church had been storing for 30 years, not knowing what to do with them, afraid to throw them away and unable to repair them themselves. Clara spent 2 weeks on those vestments, and when she returned them, clean and mended and repressed, Gordon Hale stood in the doorway and said, in a voice that was slightly unsteady, "I didn't think anyone could save those." Clara said she was glad she could. By the time the first snow fell on Greylock, the pile of work waiting on the intake shelf was 3 weeks deep, and Clara had to start a list. She was not wealthy. She was not comfortable exactly, in the cushioned way that word usually means. But she was warm and she was solvent and she was doing work that mattered, in a room that had been built to last, in a town that had started to know her name. On a November evening, she locked the workshop and walked up the hill behind it to where the old cemetery climbed the slope under bare oak trees. It wasn't hard to find the headstone Patsy had mentioned. Werner Schreiber, 1864-1931. Anneliese Schreiber, 1866-1929. The stones were old, the lettering worn but readable. Someone at some point had placed a small river rock at the base, the way people in these mountains sometimes do. Not flowers which die, but a stone which lasts. Clara stood there for a while, in the cold, her hands in her coat pockets, the one with the zipper finally repaired. She didn't say anything aloud. She just stood, the way you stand at a place that matters, letting the mattering land on you. She thought about what it means to build something and leave it behind. She thought about May with her bone thimble and her Italian shears and her perfect tension, teaching a lonely 15-year-old girl how to read the grain of a fabric, how to feel when a seam is right, how to do work that no one could argue with. She thought about Werner Schreiber, hiding a future for his daughter under a bench in a room the town had made too small for him, writing a letter to a stranger he would never meet, trusting that the work would last longer than the wound. It had lasted. She thought about what it means to be found by something. Not to find it, but to be found by it, to be the person who happens to be in the right place, in possession of the right skills, carrying the right tools. She had not chosen Greylock. She had arrived here with $8 and a broken coat and a leather case she would not give up, and something in this valley had been waiting for exactly that. We think about that sometimes, here at Homestead Stories. The way things hold. The way a room can keep a secret for 100 years because someone built it carefully enough. The way one person's grief or exile or act of desperate hope can become another person's foundation. Not by accident, but because care persists. Because the work of careful hands outlasts everything. Clara Ashfield was 22 years old. She spent her last $8 on a broken-down tailor's workshop that no one wanted, in a valley she hadn't planned to stop in a town that didn't know her name. It was the best $8 she ever spent. Before we go, we'd love to hear from you. Is there a place you once found, or a person others had written off, that turned out to hold something extraordinary? Tell us in the comments. We read everyone.